the billionaire's name was Richard Cole. The world knew him as the man who owned half the skies. He had companies spread across continents, private islands hidden in oceans, and a jet so massive and luxurious that people compared it to a flying palace. Wherever Richard went, cameras followed. Wherever he landed, red carpets rolled out. But money had also made him cold. He lived above the world, not with it. He had no time for strangers, no patience for weakness, and no mercy for failure. For him, life was about winning. And tonight, he believed, he was winning again. The jet stood ready on the runway, glowing under the floodlights. Its body was sleek silver, its engines whispering power even before takeoff. Inside, the leather seats were soft as clouds, the champagne chilled, and the flight crew lined up to bow as Richard stepped aboard. He wore his custom-tailored suit, his gold watch shining as he glanced at his phone. "Everything ready?" he asked, not even looking at the captain. "Yes, sir." "Weather is clear, flight path confirmed," the captain replied. Richard nodded, impatient. He had an urgent business deal waiting on the other side of the ocean, a deal that would make him richer than ever. Time, for him, was money, and tonight every second mattered. The engines roared, and the jet lifted into the dark sky. The city lights below shrank, fading into a blanket of stars. Richard sat back in his chair, closing his eyes with the satisfaction of a man who believed nothing could touch him. But fate had other plans. At first, it was only a small sound, a faint rattle in the walls, almost hidden under the steady hum of the engines. The flight attendants heard it but ignored it. Big machines always made noise. But then came a flicker. The cabin lights dimmed for just a second before returning. Richard opened his eyes, frowning. "What was that?" he asked. "No problem, sir." "Just a power adjustment," a flight attendant assured him, forcing a smile. But minutes later, alarms rang in the cockpit. Red lights flashed across the control panel. The captain's hands flew over the switches, his co-pilot shouting codes and warnings. The left engine was failing. Temperature rising. Pressure dropping. "Stabilize it," the captain ordered. They tried, but the jet shuddered violently, shaking like a trapped beast in the night sky. Passengers screamed. Drinks spilled. The luxury cabin that once felt untouchable now felt like a prison. Richard's glass of champagne fell to the carpet. For the first time in years, fear touched his chest. He stood, gripping the seat as turbulence threw him back down. "What's happening?" he demanded. The captain's voice came through the intercom, strained and tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a serious technical issue. Please remain calm and fasten your seatbelts. We are attempting emergency procedures." Emergency. The word rang in Richard's ears like a death bell. Outside, the night turned hostile. Lightning flashed across dark clouds. The jet dropped suddenly, a sickening plunge that made every heart skip. Luggage flew from overhead compartments. Attendants clutched the seats, praying under their breath. Richard's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest. He had survived hostile takeovers, ruthless business rivals, and scandals that destroyed lesser men, but none of those could save him now. His billions of dollars, his towers of glass, his islands of luxury useless against the failing heart of a machine 30,000 feet above the ground. The captain fought the controls. "Engine 2 failing. We're losing altitude fast." The co-pilot shouted coordinates, but their voices were swallowed by alarms. Systems were shutting down one by one. The jet was too heavy, too complex, and too proud to die quietly. It screamed as metal strained against the sky. Inside the cabin, panic spread. Passengers wept, some prayed, others screamed at the crew. And in the middle of it all, Richard Cole, the untouchable billionaire, felt the weight of mortality. He had always believed money could solve everything. But now, in the heart of the storm, money was meaningless. The captain made a desperate decision. "We can't make it to the city. We'll attempt an emergency landing at the nearest airstrip." "Nearest airstrip," the co-pilot echoed. That's a rundown field. It's barely functional." "It's our only chance," the captain growled, turning the controls. The jet descended sharply, aiming for a forgotten strip of land barely lit in the distance. Below, dark fields stretched endlessly, and in the shadows of one abandoned hangar, a pair of tired eyes watched the sky. A homeless girl. She sat near a pile of discarded blankets, her small fire burning weakly against the night chill. For days she had eaten nothing but scraps, her stomach aching, her clothes torn. People in town passed her like she was invisible. To them, she was just another piece of trash life had left behind. But she was not blind. She was not useless. She was watching the sky, and when she saw the billionaire's mighty jet limping toward the ground, smoke trailing from its side, her heart beat faster. Something inside her whispered that destiny was moving closer. The jet touched down with a bone-shaking crash. Tires screamed, sparks flew, and the metal beast skidded dangerously across the cracked runway. Inside, passengers cried out as the plane jolted, rattled, and finally screeched to a halt just yards away from disaster. Silence followed. Heavy, terrified silence. Richard's breath came in short gasps. He loosened his seatbelt with trembling fingers. The billionaire, who thought himself invincible, had just tasted the thin line between life and death. The captain's voice came again, this time calm but grim. "We have landed. But the damage is critical. The jet cannot fly again until repaired." Richard stood slowly, his legs shaking though he tried to hide it. He looked around at the frightened passengers, the powerless crew, the dark, broken runway outside. His empire could buy anything. Yet in this moment, he could buy nothing. The billionaire's jet was doomed. And he had no idea that the person who could save it was already waiting in the shadows, a girl the world had abandoned, a girl who carried knowledge far greater than anyone could guess. The night was colder than usual. The wind cut across the broken fences of the abandoned airfield, carrying with it the smell of rust and dust. A small fire burned weakly near an old hangar, its flames struggling against the breeze. Beside it sat a girl, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around them as if holding herself together. Her name was Amara. She was only 16. But the world had treated her like she was much older, much heavier, as though she had lived through decades of pain. Her skin was rough from sleeping on concrete, her hair messy, her clothes torn and faded. People passing by the streets rarely looked at her. And when they did, it was only to turn away faster. To them, she was not a girl. She was a problem. Something to be avoided. Amara stared into the fire, her stomach aching with hunger. She hadn't eaten properly in days. A half-rotten sandwich she had found near a trash bin sat beside her, but even that she had saved, afraid tomorrow might bring nothing. Hunger was cruel, but hope was crueler. She had once hoped for more. Long ago, Amara was different. She had been one of the brightest students in her school. Teachers used to say she had an engineer's mind. While other kids played games, she opened radios, clocks, even old washing machines, and rebuilt them. She loved machines, loved the way they had order, rules, logic. Machines didn't lie, didn't hurt, didn't betray. They worked if you understood them. But life was not a machine. Life broke without warning. When her mother fell sick and her father abandoned them, everything collapsed. Hospital bills swallowed their home. Friends disappeared. Family closed their doors. And when her mother died, Amara had nowhere to go. The girl who once dreamed of building engines now searched trash bins for food. As she stared at the fire, her ears caught a sound, faint at first, then louder. A roar in the sky. She looked up. Her heart skipped. Above her, cutting through the dark clouds, came a massive jet, its lights blinking, its engines screaming in pain. One side smoked heavily, fire flickering near the wing. The machine wobbled dangerously as it descended toward the airfield. Amara jumped to her feet, her eyes wide. She had seen jets before, but never one in such trouble. The roar grew deafening as the plane scraped against the runway, sparks flying, metal shrieking. The ground trembled under her feet as the giant beast skidded, slowed, and finally came to a shaking stop only a few hundred meters away from her fire. Silence followed. Thick, terrifying silence. Amara stood frozen, staring at the enormous shadow of the jet resting like a wounded animal in the dark. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her breath came fast, her body tense. Then she saw people inside, shadows moving behind the windows, lights flickering weakly. She wasn't afraid of the jet. She wasn't afraid of the people. What caught her attention was something else. She had heard that sound before. The grinding noise of a failing turbine, the irregular pulse of a clogged engine valve, the desperate whine of a machine gasping for air. Her mind, sharp even after hunger and hardship, instantly recognized it. The jet wasn't just damaged. It was broken in a way no one would expect. And somehow, she knew exactly what it was. Inside the plane, chaos still ruled. Passengers tried to calm themselves, crew rushed to check damage, the captain barked orders. Richard Cole sat in silence, his jaw tight, his mind spinning with anger and fear. "How long until we can fly again?" he demanded. The captain shook his head. "I don't know, sir. The engine is critical. Without major repair, this jet is grounded." "Grounded?" Richard snapped. "Do you know who I am? I can't stay here in the middle of nowhere." The captain didn't reply. He had bigger problems than ego. Amara, meanwhile, began walking closer, her bare feet silent against the cracked ground. The fire of curiosity burned brighter than her fear. She saw the jet's massive body up close, saw the smoke trailing from the engine. She placed her hand gently against the metal, feeling its heat, hearing the faint hum of life still inside it. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself. "They tried to reroute the pressure, but it's not the valve. It's the intake. It's choking." Her words meant nothing to the world around her, but to the machine, they meant everything. She understood it, the way a musician understands a song. And in that moment, the invisible line of fate began to draw tighter. The crew outside noticed her. One of the mechanics shouted, "Hey! Get away from there!" Amara stepped back, startled, her hands trembling. She wasn't supposed to be here. People didn't want her near. People never wanted her near. But her eyes stayed fixed on the engine. She knew she was right. She knew she could help. For a long second, she fought with herself. She could walk away, return to her fire, let the world ignore her again. Or she could step forward and speak, risk the laughter, the insults, the rejection. Her lips parted. She took a shaky breath. And with all the courage left in her broken body, she whispered the words that would change her life forever. I can fix it." The mechanic froze, then burst into laughter. "You? Fix this jet? What are you, a street rat?" Others turned to look. Crew members sneered. Passengers pressed their faces against the windows, watching the strange scene. Richard himself, hearing the noise outside, stepped down from the cabin stairs, his expensive shoes hitting the cracked ground. He saw her, the thin, dirty girl standing by his billion-dollar jet. For a moment, their eyes met. One belonged to the richest man in the sky. The other to a girl the world had thrown into the dirt. And yet, in that silent meeting, something unspoken passed between them. The mechanic shook his head, waving her away. "Go back to wherever you came from. This is no place for you." Amara lowered her gaze, shame burning inside her. But she couldn't stop herself. The words escaped again, firmer this time. "I know what's wrong. You're looking in the wrong place. The problem is deeper than the valves. It's in the airflow intake. If you don't fix it, the engine will never start again." The mechanic froze mid-step. The captain frowned. Even the co-pilot blinked in surprise. And Richard Cole, the billionaire who thought he had seen everything, narrowed his eyes. Something in her tone, something in her certainty, it didn't sound like a guess. It sounded like truth. The night held its breath. The jet stood broken, the passengers restless, the crew doubtful. And there, on a forgotten runway, stood a girl the world had thrown away, a girl who had nothing, but spoke as if she held the key to saving them all. The story of Amara and the billionaire had just begun. The air smelled of burned metal and smoke. The jet rested crooked on the runway, its wounded engine hissing as if it were alive and suffering. The passengers had been escorted out, shivering in the cold night air, whispering fears about being stranded in the middle of nowhere. The flight crew and mechanics worked quickly, pulling out tools, opening panels, shining lights inside the damaged engine. Orders were shouted, wires pulled, switches tested. But every attempt ended the same way: silence, failure, frustration. Richard Cole paced near the stairs of his jet like a caged lion. His polished shoes clicked against the cracked ground, his expensive suit still perfect despite the chaos around him. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp with anger. "How long?" he barked. The captain wiped sweat from his brow. "We're trying, sir. But this damage is unusual. We've never seen an engine respond like this." Richard's voice rose, cutting like a whip. "You're telling me I paid billions for a machine that can't even land properly? Fix it. I don't care what it takes. I have a meeting in the morning, do you understand?" The mechanic beside the captain muttered under his breath, "This isn't about meetings. This is about keeping the plane alive." Richard heard him. His face darkened. "What did you say?" The mechanic looked down, silent. Richard's rage boiled, but before he could explode, a small voice broke through the night. "I told you already, it's the intake." The words came from Amara. She stood a few steps away, her thin arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her eyes fixed on the open engine. The firelight from her little camp still flickered in the distance, but now she stood in the circle of floodlights around the jet, out of place, unwanted yet unshaken. Everyone turned to stare. Some laughed under their breath. Some shook their heads. The mechanic sneered. "Not this again. Go away, kid. This isn't your playground." But Richard's eyes didn't leave her. There was something in her voice, in the way she said it. Not begging. Not guessing. Stating. He took a step forward. "You think you know more than trained engineers?" Amara swallowed, her voice trembling but steady. "I know what I hear. The engine isn't breathing. You can replace every valve, every switch, but it won't start. You have to clear the intake. There's something stuck where you're not looking." The captain raised an eyebrow. "How could you possibly?" Richard cut him off. His pride fought against his curiosity, but his fear of being stranded pushed harder. "Fine. Let her try." The words shocked everyone. The crew gasped. The mechanic dropped his wrench. "Sir, with all respect," the captain said carefully, "she's just a homeless girl. If we let her near the engine and she makes it worse." Richard's glare silenced him. "If you could fix it, we wouldn't still be on the ground. Move aside. She gets one chance." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't expected him to say yes. Her hands trembled, but not from fear, from the weight of the moment. For the first time in years, someone was letting her touch a machine again. She stepped forward, climbing the small ladder to reach the engine. The metal was still warm under her fingers, the smell of oil thick in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. She always listened first. Machines spoke to her in ways people never understood. Behind her, the crew whispered. "This is insane. She'll break something. Why's he even letting her try?" Richard stood apart, his arms crossed, watching with cold intensity. Deep inside, doubt gnawed at him. What if this girl was just another crazy voice in the night? But another thought clawed at him too: what if she was right? Amara leaned into the engine, her eyes scanning the shadows inside. She reached for a flashlight. The mechanic reluctantly handed it to her, muttering, "Don't drop it." Her thin hands moved carefully, gently, as if she were touching something alive. And then she froze. "There," she whispered. The captain frowned. "What?" She pointed. Deep inside the intake, wedged against the airflow system, was a piece of twisted metal debris sucked in during the emergency descent. It blocked the passage completely, choking the engine. The captain's eyes widened. The mechanic cursed under his breath. They hadn't even checked that part yet. Amara's voice grew stronger. It's jammed. That's why the valves failed. That's why the pressure kept dropping. The engine was starving. Richard's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding. Can you remove it? Amara looked at the tools scattered on the ground. Her hands itched to grab them. Yes. The mechanic laughed harshly. This is madness. Even if she's right, this engine is worth more than her life. We can't just hand her tools and hope for the best. Richard's voice thundered like the storm above. I said, let her try. The mechanic fell silent. Amara picked up a wrench, the cold steel heavy in her grip. She adjusted it with skill, her fingers remembering movements she hadn't practiced in years. She slid deeper into the engine, twisting, pulling, loosening bolts. Sweat dripped from her forehead. Her hands grew dirty with oil and grease. But her eyes never wavered. The crew watched in stunned silence. This girl, who minutes ago had been nothing but a shadow by a fire, now moved with the precision of someone born to do this. Richard felt a strange unease. He had always believed talent came from the top, from schools, from wealth, from privilege. But watching her, he realized he was seeing something rawer, something real. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, Amara let out a grunt and pulled hard. With a screech of metal, the twisted shard came free. She held it up, her chest rising and falling with effort. This was killing your engine, she said simply. The captain stared. The mechanic's jaw dropped. Richard took the piece from her hand, turning it in the light. It was jagged, sharp, deadly. Without removing it, the jet would have never flown again. Now try it, Amara said, wiping her greasy hands on her torn shirt. The captain hesitated. Richard's gaze pinned him like a blade. Do it! The crew rushed back inside. Switches flipped. Lights blinked. Then, with a roar that shook the night, the engine coughed, sputtered, and finally came back to life. The sound grew steady, strong, powerful. The machine was breathing again. Cheers erupted from the crew. Passengers clapped and shouted in relief. Richard did not cheer. He stood still, his eyes locked on the girl standing in the floodlights, her face tired, her clothes dirty, but her eyes blazing with fire. She had done what his money, his crew, his world-class machine could not. She had saved his jet. But in the silence that followed, Richard realized something else. She had also shaken something deep inside him, something he thought was long dead. The night was not over. The jet was alive again, but questions hung in the air heavier than the smoke. Who was this girl? Where had she come from? And how could someone with nothing carry knowledge greater than those with everything? The billionaire's journey had just taken a turn he could never have imagined. The roar of the engine still echoed across the airfield like the heartbeat of a beast brought back from the dead. The once doomed jet now hummed with steady power, its lights glowing, its body vibrating with life. For the crew and passengers, it was a miracle. For Richard Cole, it was something far more dangerous. It was a challenge to everything he believed in. The billionaire stood with the piece of twisted debris still in his hand, the sharp edge catching the light. He turned it slowly, his thoughts racing. Money, status, power, all of it had failed him tonight. And then a girl, dirty, homeless, and ignored by society, had stepped in and saved what no one else could. She stood a few feet away, breathing heavily, her thin frame trembling not with fear but with exhaustion. Grease streaked her arms, oil stained her shirt, and sweat rolled down her forehead. Yet her eyes held something steady, a quiet strength, a fire that poverty had not been able to kill. For the first time in years, Richard didn't know what to say. The captain broke the silence. Sir, she's right. Without clearing the intake, we would never have restarted. She saved the aircraft. The mechanic muttered, shame in his voice, I should have checked it. I didn't. But she just knew. Murmurs spread among the crew. Some looked at Amara with respect now, others with disbelief, but no one laughed anymore. Richard stepped closer to her. His voice was low, sharp. "Who are you?" Amara lowered her gaze. "No one." Richard's brows furrowed. "No one doesn't fix billion-dollar jets." She hesitated, hugging her arms tighter around herself. I just know machines. Always have." The captain interjected carefully. "Sir, we should inspect again before we take off. This engine still needs adjustments." Richard ignored him, his eyes locked on the girl. Something inside him, buried under years of arrogance, was waking. He couldn't explain it: curiosity, respect, maybe even guilt. But before he could speak again, another alarm beeped from inside the cockpit. The crew rushed in. The captain shouted, "Pressure's unstable again. Engine still not balanced." The cheers of moments ago died instantly. The passengers groaned, fear returning. The mechanic cursed, slamming his wrench down. "This jet's too damaged. Clearing the intake wasn't enough. We can't fix this in the field." All eyes turned back to Richard. For once, the billionaire had no command ready. His empire of solutions had run dry. And then Amara's voice cut through the panic again. "You didn't realign the feed lines after clearing it." Everyone turned. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, but her voice was steady. "The system is still forcing pressure through the damaged path. You have to reroute it manually. If you don't, the imbalance will destroy the turbine within minutes." The captain's jaw dropped. "How could you possibly know that?" Amara didn't answer. She just walked closer, her eyes fixed on the engine as if she could see through the metal. Richard's chest tightened. Against every instinct, against his pride, he heard himself say, "Do it." This time, no one argued. Amara climbed back onto the ladder. She asked for tools: a spanner, a wrench, a flathead. The mechanic handed them without protest now. She moved with surprising speed, her fingers sure, her mind racing ahead of her body. She loosened bolts, redirected connections, adjusted wiring. The captain leaned toward Richard, whispering, "It's impossible. She shouldn't know this. This system is custom-built, top secret. Only trained engineers see this level of design." Richard didn't reply. His eyes never left the girl. Amara muttered to herself as she worked, her voice like a mechanic's prayer. "Flow here, block here, too much pressure, it needs release." She twisted one final bolt, tightened it with all her strength, and then climbed down, her arms trembling from effort. "Try it now," she said. The crew rushed inside. Switches flipped again. Lights blinked. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared, stronger than before. This time, the sound was not shaky but smooth, powerful, clean. The vibration of imbalance was gone. The captain's voice came over the intercom, disbelief thick in every word. "System stable. Engine balanced. We're fully operational." For a long second, no one moved. The crew stared at Amara. Passengers pressed their faces against the windows, whispering. The mechanic shook his head in amazement. And Richard Cole, the man who had bought everything in life, who had never bent to anyone, found himself clapping slowly, softly, like a man seeing something sacred. The sound startled everyone. Billionaires didn't clap. Not for anyone. But Richard couldn't stop himself. He walked toward her, his steps deliberate, his eyes fierce. "You didn't just fix my jet," he said, his voice low. "You fixed the impossible." Amara shook her head quickly. "No. I just saw what was wrong." Richard leaned closer, studying her. "You saw what no one else could. Not my crew, not my engineers, not my money. You did it with nothing but your mind. That is not just. That is genius." Amara froze. No one had ever spoken that word to her before. Genius. To the world, she was dirt. To him, in this moment, she was something else entirely. But before the warmth could spread, the captain spoke again. "Sir, we should prepare for takeoff. We can leave within minutes." Richard nodded, but his gaze never left Amara. She had already stepped back, ready to return to her fire, to her forgotten place in the shadows. To her, this was temporary. She had helped. Now she would disappear again. But Richard's voice stopped her. "Wait." She froze. Slowly, she turned. Richard took a deep breath. He had spent his life giving orders, demanding results, breaking people into pieces for his empire. But now his words were different. They carried something rare. Respect. "You saved me tonight. Not just my jet, me. My crew. My passengers. My life. And I don't even know your name." Amara hesitated, her throat tight. Finally, she whispered, "Amara." Richard nodded slowly, the name rolling on his tongue like it mattered. "Amara. I won't forget that." The passengers began boarding again, relief filling their voices. The crew checked final systems. The storm above cleared, stars peeking through the clouds. But Richard Cole, the billionaire who thought he had everything, knew the truth. Tonight, a girl who had nothing had shown him a kind of power money could never buy. And deep inside, something shifted. For the first time in his life, Richard Cole felt small. And for the first time in her life, Amara felt seen. The jet was ready to fly again. But neither Richard nor Amara knew that what had just happened was only the beginning. Because machines could be fixed in a night. But broken lives took far longer. And the girl who had just saved the billionaire's jet carried a story darker, heavier, and more painful than anyone could imagine. The jet was alive again. Its engines hummed with steady power, the night sky ready to welcome it back. Passengers boarded quickly, relief washing over them, their earlier fear melting into hurried chatter. To them, this was simply a miracle of luck. A near disaster avoided. But outside, near the runway lights, Richard Cole stood still. His eyes never left Amara. She was wiping her greasy hands on her torn shirt, ready to fade back into the shadows, back to the forgotten fire that was her world. To her, this night was an interruption, nothing more. She had done what she could, and now she expected to return to being invisible. But Richard's voice stopped her again. "Not yet." She froze, her body stiff, her face wary. Slowly she turned back. The way he looked at her now was different. Not as a billionaire looking at a beggar. But as a man who had just been humbled by someone the world had crushed. "Why were you here?" Richard asked. His tone wasn't harsh anymore. It was curious, almost gentle. Amara looked down. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the jet. Finally, she whispered, "Because I have nowhere else to be." Richard's chest tightened. He had expected excuses, maybe lies. Instead, her answer was sharp and bare, like broken glass. The captain approached. "Sir, everything is ready for takeoff. We can leave within minutes." Richard raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes stayed on Amara. "What happened to you?" Amara shook her head. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Richard said firmly. She studied him, suspicious. People never asked her story. People never cared. The world only saw dirt on her clothes, hunger in her eyes, and turned away. Why would a man like him care? But something in his tone broke through her defenses. Slowly, with hesitation in every word, she spoke. "I used to have a home. A family. My mom, she worked 2 jobs. She always smiled, even when she was tired. She believed I was going to be someone great. She said my hands were made for building. That one day, I designed machines the world had never seen." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I loved machines. I fixed broken radios from trash, rewired old TVs, even made a fan work from spare wires. At school, teachers said I was special. I wanted to study engineering. I wanted a real future. She paused, swallowing hard. Her eyes glistened. But life doesn't care about dreams. My mom got sick. Hospitals took everything. We lost our home. My father, he left. Said he couldn't handle it. After Mom died, I had nothing. No one. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. Richard's throat tightened as he listened. Amara looked away. Since then, I've lived here. On the streets. People look at me like I'm dirt. They don't see my mind. They don't care. I'm just invisible. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Until tonight. Richard couldn't breathe for a moment. He had spent his life building empires, stacking towers of glass, collecting cars, islands, and jets. And here was this girl, brilliant, gifted, with more natural genius in her hands than half his board of directors, left to rot in the shadows. Shame cut through him. He had never cared for the poor. To him, they were lazy, weak, undeserving. But now he was staring at proof of the opposite. This girl wasn't weak. She wasn't lazy. She had been crushed by a world that rewarded greed and punished innocence. And he realized, painfully, that he was part of that world. The captain cleared his throat again. Sir, the passengers are waiting. Richard's gaze snapped to him, sharp. They can wait. The crew exchanged nervous looks. No one dared interrupt again. Richard turned back to Amara. Do you know what you did tonight? Amara frowned. I fixed a jet. No, Richard said, shaking his head slowly. You saved lives. Mine. Everyone's on this plane. Do you understand that? And you did it without training, without equipment, without recognition. Amara looked down, embarrassed. Anyone could have done it. Richard stepped closer, his voice low but firm. No. Not anyone. Only you. The words made Amara's chest ache. Praise was foreign to her. Recognition was something she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, she almost believed him. But then reality returned. Her eyes hardened. What difference does it make? Tomorrow I'll still be on the street. Hungry. Forgotten. People like me don't get second chances. Richard froze. Her words hit harder than any storm. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He had spent his entire life ignoring people like her, stepping over them on sidewalks, never once wondering about their stories. And now, one of them had saved him. For the first time, Richard Cole felt ashamed of his empire. The captain called out one last time. Sir, please. We need to leave now. Richard exhaled slowly. He looked at his jet, at the glowing cabin filled with impatient millionaires, at the powerful engines humming once more. Then he looked at Amara, thin, dirty, tired, but blazing with a brilliance that money could never buy. The decision formed inside him like thunder. You're coming with me. Amara's eyes widened. What? Richard's tone left no room for argument. You saved my jet. You saved me. You don't belong out here. You're coming with me. Tonight. Amara shook her head quickly. No. I can't. I don't belong in your world. Richard's voice softened. You don't belong in the dirt either. The crew stared in disbelief. Passengers whispered inside the jet, pressing against the windows. A billionaire offering to take in a homeless girl? It was unheard of. Unthinkable. But Richard didn't care what anyone thought. For the first time in his life, he wasn't acting for cameras, money, or power. He was acting for something deeper. Because in this girl, he didn't just see a savior of his jet. He saw the reflection of a world he had ignored. And maybe, a chance to change himself. Amara's lips trembled. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run back to her fire, back to the familiar pain of the shadows. It was safer there. At least pain was predictable. But when she looked at Richard, she saw something strange in his eyes. Not pity. Not disgust. Respect. Her heart, long hardened by the streets, cracked open just a little. I don't know, she whispered. Richard nodded once, firmly. Then let me show you. Get on the jet. The night stretched silent around them, the hum of the engines waiting, the stars watching. Amara stood on the edge of two worlds, the one that had abandoned her, and the one that terrified her. And as she took a single hesitant step toward the stairs of the billionaire's jet, fate shifted once more. The jet was no longer just his. It was now theirs. The stairs to the jet looked taller than mountains to Amara. She hesitated at the bottom, her dirty shoes pressed against the smooth metal step. Behind her, the cold runway stretched empty. Ahead of her, the glowing cabin waited, filled with luxury she had never touched in her life. She almost turned back. Almost. But then she heard Richard's voice from the doorway above. Come on. You've already done the hard part. Something in his tone, is steady, calm, almost fatherly, gave her the strength to lift her foot. One step. Then another. Slowly, she climbed. By the time she reached the top, her hands trembled. Her heart raced. And when she stepped into the cabin, the world shifted. The passengers stared at her. Some with open shock, others with disgust. Their diamond rings glittered as they clutched glasses of champagne. Their clothes were flawless, their shoes polished, their perfume strong. And here came a girl in torn clothes, her face smeared with grease, her hair tangled, her shoes worn thin. A man in a suit whispered too loudly, "Who is she? Why is she here?" A woman muttered, "This is unacceptable. She'll stain the seats." Amara froze, shame burning her cheeks. She wanted to run back down the stairs. She didn't belong here. But then Richard's voice cut through the whispers. Strong. Cold. Final. She is the reason you're alive right now. Show her respect. The cabin went silent. Richard walked past them, ignoring their shocked faces, and placed a firm hand on Amara's shoulder. Sit wherever you like, he said. Amara's throat tightened. She nodded quickly and slipped into a seat near the back, her body tense, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time in her life, she sat inside a billionaire's jet, not as a cleaner, not as invisible, but as someone who mattered. The engines roared again. Slowly, the jet lifted into the night sky, smooth and powerful. But for Richard, this flight was unlike any other. He didn't care about the deal waiting overseas, the millions at stake, or the headlines that would follow. His eyes stayed on Amara. She sat quietly, staring out the window as clouds drifted past. There was awe in her eyes, but also fear. Like she expected the world to snatch this moment away at any second. Richard leaned closer. You've never flown before, have you? She shook her head silently. He smiled faintly. Then tonight is your first. And it won't be your last. As the hours passed, Amara slowly relaxed. The attendants, once unsure, began offering her food and drinks. She hesitated at first, embarrassed, but hunger won. The first bite of warm bread brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't tasted anything so fresh in months. Richard watched quietly, a lump in his throat. To him, bread was nothing. He barely noticed it at his table of endless meals. But to her, it was life itself. When she finally whispered, "Thank you," her voice cracked with emotion. Richard nodded. No. Thank you. Later, when the cabin dimmed for the night, Richard invited her to the front lounge. The room was quiet, away from the other passengers. Just leather seats, a small table, and the endless night sky outside the windows. Amara, he began, do you know why I asked you to come with me? She frowned. Because I fixed your jet? Yes. But not just that. He leaned forward. You showed me something tonight that money couldn't buy. Bravery. Genius. Heart. You reminded me that I've spent too long building towers and too little time noticing the people at the bottom of them. Amara looked down, unsure what to say. Richard's voice softened. I don't want to go back to that life, pretending people like you don't exist. I want to change. And I think you can help me. Her head shot up, eyes wide. Me? Yes, Richard said simply. You. For a moment, Amara couldn't breathe. She had spent years believing she was worthless, invisible. Now this man, the untouchable billionaire, was telling her she mattered. That she could change things. Her chest ached, her eyes stung, and her hands shook. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe this wasn't a dream. But fear whispered in her ear. What if it doesn't last? What if he changes his mind? Richard seemed to read her silence. I don't make promises lightly. But I promise you this, as long as I'm alive, you'll never be invisible again. Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks. She turned away, ashamed, but Richard gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Cry if you need to, he said softly. You've carried too much alone. And in that quiet lounge, 30,000 feet above the ground, the girl who had been abandoned by the world finally let go. She cried, not from weakness, but from release. From years of hunger, loss, and silence. Richard didn't look away. He didn't judge. He simply stayed, steady as the sky around them. By the time the jet touched down hours later, a decision had already been made in Richard's heart. When reporters crowded the runway, flashing cameras and firing questions, he didn't talk about his deal. He didn't brag about surviving the near crash. Instead, he placed his hand on Amara's shoulder and said clearly, "This girl saved us all. Remember her face. Her name is Amara. And from today, her life changes." The crowd gasped. Cameras clicked furiously. Headlines exploded. The billionaire who never cared for anyone but himself was suddenly announcing a homeless girl as his savior. And Amara, blinking under the blinding lights, took her first step into a future she never thought possible. In the days that followed, the world learned her story. Reporters dug into her past, and instead of mocking her, people wept. Strangers reached out with letters, gifts, scholarships. Engineers and scientists praised her genius. Students said she inspired them. For the first time, the world saw not just her hunger and dirt, but her brilliance. And for Richard, every step of the way, she stood beside him, not as charity, not as pity, but as proof that even the forgotten can rise. One night, weeks later, Amara stood on the balcony of Richard's tower, looking out at the glittering city. The sky stretched above her, endless and free. Richard joined her quietly. How does it feel? She smiled faintly, her eyes shining. Like I finally exist. Richard nodded slowly. No. You always existed. The world just forgot to look. Amara's heart swelled. For the first time since her mother's death, she believed in tomorrow. The billionaire's jet had been doomed that night. But instead of ending in fire, it had brought two broken worlds together. And in the end, the girl who was invisible became unforgettable.